I think you wanted to comment, and I would like also to ask you a question. If you think that leadership means the same for men as it is for women.
Which one do you want me to answer first? Either one?
You choose.
Okay, I'll actually address the point about that you were just making about governments the bank should be required to serve. The bank should be required to serve the people and not the government. I think sometimes it's hard to divorce those two things in practice because governments often behave in a way that they know will get them more votes. So they're thinking that by acting a certain way vis-a-vis the banks that it'll be popular with the people, like what happened in the United States. And one of the primary reasons why there's a crisis right now and a credit crisis in the United States and why the housing market in the United States collapsed is because during the Clinton administration, he was trying to pander for votes among the population, especially among lower or middle income people who normally, under previous rules, could not afford to get a mortgage to buy a new house. They wanted to get a house, they might have been renting because they couldn't yet afford to feasibly buy a house, or they couldn't afford to get a mortgage. But he thought, look, if there's a way to make it easier for people to get a mortgage and to force the banks to give them mortgages, then obviously we can say that we increased home ownership under the Clinton administration, and we will get more votes. So that's what he did through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, other institutions that basically forced banks to give loans to people who couldn't afford, or for all intents and purposes, could not afford to buy a house. So these people were getting mortgages because the law had changed under the Clinton administration. They couldn't pay back these loans. Suddenly you have the banks absorbing the debt, doing a bunch of shuffling to figure out how they're going to pay for that. And everybody gets into this habit. Meanwhile, the population 10 years later is in the habit of buying on credit. And, because they already have a house they can't afford. So this is the kind of trend that we've seen since the mid-90s that has been encouraged by politicians, not necessarily because they care about their friends who are bankers, but because they know that to pander to the electorate, to give to the electorate, they have to make deals with the banks, and that's ultimately what happens. So I'm not again sure that banks are necessarily in a cozy relationship with politicians strictly for the sake of that relationship. Okay. Second point: do women?
Very short.
Yeah,
answer.
Sure. The women in leadership. I don't really see women as being a different type of human being, really, especially when it comes to roles of leadership. I think women generally at that level like to see less battle of egos, a little more seriousness, for example.
But sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
In China, 19% of the CEO are women, when you have only 9% in the European Union and 5% in North America. How do you explain that?
Quotas, control. In China, we're often dealing with a system where it's who you know, so maybe they're women who know people. In a democracy, it's a lot harder for women to be taken seriously in politics. I don't think it's false to say that, because it still very much is a man's world. Women, if they were to behave like men often do in politics in Western democracies, would never be taken seriously. We can't walk into a meeting and play around. We'd be considered a flake and dismissed. So I think women have to be a bit more serious in order to obtain those leadership roles in democracies. And then there's a whole bunch of ideas around the serious woman. Hillary Clinton has been subject to a lot of criticism with regard to how she behaves, and it's not, because she doesn't behave like a man in politics. Why isn't she funny? That's what you hear a lot of. Why isn't she funny? She's not funny because to be taken seriously at that level, you can't joke around. To get to that level, you can't joke around. And in China, again, I think a lot of women simply have family connections, have governmental connections, and that supersedes everything else in those countries where it's not an open democracy.
So prepare yourself for question. I will open the floor in 1 minute. I would like just to ask a question to Cheikh Modibo. 2 weeks ago, Forbes magazine has published the list of the 70 most influential and powerful people in the world. No one is an African. And since 2 days, I am hearing so accurate, so smart point, even now, from the panel. Congratulations to you. How do you explain that?
You know, anybody who has sense knows that in the continent of Africa that has reached the 1 billion people level, that there are certainly a lot of men and women who are ethically fit, who have moral courage, who work every day, who are smart, who are innovating, even in the areas of technology today. You know, using the cell phone to actually make payments. And those kind of things have been invented in Africa, not in the United States. Now, if despite all that, Forbes think that there is no influential people, no leader in the South, you know, I think it is simply because these kind of comments have been happening for too long. The media in the North have the tendency, when it comes to actually doing this kind of thing, just limit themselves to their little geometry that they know. They don't go around investigating the rest of the world. And quite frankly, I'm not even sure if the journalists at Forbes magazine know Africa, if any of them have been to Africa, or if they're aware of what is going on in Africa. And this is all part of the debate that we are making here. You find the same thing all over. Everybody is focused in bringing the creme to the side, pulling the cover to the side instead of looking at things globally. I am sure that even this global crisis that is taking place, when you dig a little deeper, you will find that the solution of that crisis will come from the South, actually starting to order things from the economies of the North to get it going again. But yet, you know, they will present it as if the North has found solution. We have heard the position of our governor here. You know, who in their mind will say that this is not a leader?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kind of thing. So, just to conclude that, I think that we should not, because Forbes is a global magazine, just strive all our best to see our people's name in Forbes. We have our own Forbes magazine across the continent, and that is largely sufficient for us. And when the dust settles, then we will see that we can consolidate then our two lists.
Excellent, thank you. President Toledo, bravo. President Toledo, Sikatani, we have a lot of young, very talented people in the room. What would be the advice that you can give them to become in the very near future leaders?
You have posed a question very intelligently at the beginning about the crisis of leadership. There is no incongruency between political leadership and entrepreneurs. Leaders need to have the courage to tell entrepreneurs in Africa, in Latin America, in the Arab world, welcome to invest in mining, gold, silver, copper, oil, gas. But you have to comply with certain responsibilities of not to contaminate the water or the environment. Establishing the rules of the game, clear. Secondly, I tell my business friends around the world that you have 2.4 billion people who are living below the poverty line, defined in terms of $1 a day. 2.4 billion people in the world are living with less than $1 a day. Forget about your social responsibility, your social sensitivity. Look at it in terms of rate of return to your investment. Can you imagine, my friend? If that 2.4 billion people could be incorporated in the market, they will have some income in their pocket, and they could buy water, milk, bread, iPhone, Google, Yahoo. It's a potential market that's extraordinary. So it is convenient for business to contribute to the reduction of poverty because they will increase the rate of return to their investment. 3, the best way that I know to create a leadership is we, my friends in Africa and Latin America and the Arab world, not to be complacent with exporting raw material to the world. We need to invest, number 1, in nutrition, healthcare, and quality of education. There is no more profitable investment that an individual or society can make than investing in the minds of the people. 3, invest in technology, research, and development. Create those 3 components and you create a leader. A leader who has the capacity to question, not to be complacent, not to be afraid, to disagree. A leader that is not afraid to tell President Obama that we disagree and we agree. To tell Sarkozy that we can agree and disagree, that we can have points of view different, and that the world does no longer belongs only to China, to the Eurozone, or to the United States. In this world, we are living all under the same roof. And the leadership, when you ask the question, is never be afraid to say your word. Now, to say your word, you need to have the opportunity to have access to a good quality of education. I'm a living evidence of what education can do in the world. Had not it been for education, I would have never have become a professor of Harvard or Stanford or even a president of my country. And now trying to lead the world in Latin America. Final point. I've been 3 weeks ago in Tunisia leading a mission for the elections. And I never have seen people crying to the opportunity of exercising the right to go to vote. Democracy. Freedom. And democracy and freedom is not just the right to go to vote on an election day. Freedom is the right to choose. And I answer your question by saying you are only free when you have the right to choose, and you only can have the right to choose when you are educated and have options. The difference between men and women, between black and white, between different social backgrounds are through education. Let us not export our raw materials without giving aggregate value, and we provide aggregate value through knowledge. That is how I see the potential leadership of the world for the future.
Monsieur Siktani, vous avez un petit conseil à donner à nos amis avant qu'on prenne des questions?
Moi, sincèrement, je vais brièvement, je vais dans le sens de son excellence. Je crois que le leadership, c'est aussi partir dans la vie sans complexe, mais sans arrogance, avec beaucoup d'humilité. Modestement, le groupe Tanger et Wafabank a initié, sur les 5 dernières années, des investissements à l'échelon africain. Nous avons acquis une dizaine de banques sur les 5 dernières années. Et on est dans 11 pays africains. Qu'est-ce que nous constatons? Nous constatons que la Banque internationale, quand elle s'est intéressée à l'Afrique, elle a accompagné uniquement les multinationales pour financer l'extraction des ressources naturelles et les rapatrier vers le nord. Et elle s'est intéressée à la bourgeoisie de ces pays. Les petites entreprises, les PME, PMI, les entrepreneurs individuels, les classes moyennes étaient livrés à eux-mêmes. Et ce que nous avons déployé, c'est l'expérience qui nous a réussi au Maroc, c'est-à-dire aller vers l'entreprise de petite taille, de petites et moyennes entreprises, et accompagner la génération d'une nouvelle race d'entrepreneurs africains sans complexe, qui peuvent compter sur eux-mêmes et qui peuvent compter sur des institutions africaines. Et je crois que le pari est en train d'être réussi par quelques groupes bancaires africains. Il y a les banques nigériennes, il y a des groupes panafricains qui sont en train de donner la chance à une nouvelle race d'entrepreneurs. Et je crois que le leadership, quelque part, là aussi, et c'est là où je m'arrêterai, c'est de ne compter que sur soi-même avant de tendre la main aux autres. Donc, il faut que le Sud, là aussi, parte sans complexe vers la construction de son avenir en toute sérénité. Et merci.
Merci. Est-ce qu'on a des micros dans la salle, s'il vous plaît? Si on peut les... So, question from the floor. Yeah, we have a question here at the first row. Madame? Please, essayez d'être bref, s'il vous plaît, hein, dans votre question. On peut ouvrir le micro, blanc. Yes.
Oui, merci. Bonjour, messieurs, dames. Je me présente, Leïla Khalifa, présidente de l'association Leïla pour la citoyenneté d'honneur. Je vous donne la solution aujourd'hui, 19 novembre 2011, à partir de Tanger au forum de MEDays 2011. Voilà. Pour surmonter la crise et sauver l'économie, je propose aux pays riches d'investir dans les pays pauvres, à commencer par le Maroc, parce que le Maroc, c'est un pays qui est l'ami des 5 continents et qui est, par excellence, un pays stratégique, un pays d'agriculture par excellence et un pays de tourisme par excellence.
Est-ce que vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît?
Oui,
parce
une question. Est-ce que monsieur le président, l'ex-président, monsieur Toledo, peut investir chez nous au Maroc?
Merci.
Je suis venue vous inviter à investir au Maroc.
So the question is, would you be ready to invest in Morocco?
Well, you have anticipated what I had in mind to make a proposition. You know, to make an omelet, you have to be ready to break an egg. I suggest that this event, it's extraordinary initiative, MEDays. Next year, September 2012, is going to be a meeting of the Arab world and Latin America and Peru. Let me suggest the following. Before the head of the states get together to talk about big politics and public relations, why can't we do a conference of substance such as this 3 or 4 days before the summit, and we can do together with the MEDays Institute and a foundation that we have in Latin America to deal with those issues, to be propositive, to have the courage to be provocative, and maybe we will have the privilege to have the same extraordinary moderator. So, number one. And number two, I have been invited to Morocco by His Majesty, the King Mohammed VI. That's why I'm over here and invited by this institute. Well, tomorrow I'm going to meet with the leader of the entrepreneurs in Morocco. And I'm asking them to come in a submission of 10 or 15 of them to come to Peru, and I will put them together with the entrepreneur leaders of Peru to put it together and see what they can do. I will pay for the lunch in Peru.
Donc, vous voyez, à défaut, il commence déjà à payer le déjeuner des investisseurs. Thank you very much. Question here. Une question, micro, s'il vous plaît. Le jeune homme, présentez-vous, s'il vous plaît. Essayez d'être bref dans votre question. Et à qui elle s'adresse?
I'll be very brief.
Please.
My name is Gilbert. In business school. My question to the panel is that don't you think that the only right form of leadership should be a transparent form of leadership that is free of corruption? As the leaders of today have turned leadership into a business venture. And before you respond to me, I'll just quote, we live in a world of today where the leaders of today have always promised us we are the leaders of tomorrow, but they have always ensured that tomorrow never comes. It is now time to tell them that tomorrow they talk about is today. Thank you very much.
Governor, maybe you want to answer to your question. You were fighting a lot in your country against corruption. I think you did very well.
I think that the problems of corruption are institutional. And they're not as difficult as we think they are. It just requires a few people to stand up and fight against them. Very often you find that corruption thrives when you create the opportunity for it to thrive. President Toledo talked about deregulation, for example. The whole idea of having regulators around the banks was to protect depositors. We went into a phase in the world where people came up with this word called deregulation, which basically meant let the banks take people's money and then don't look closely at what they do with the money and don't ask them any questions. Now, once you take that step, it's a very short step towards corruption because then you're leaving it really to the moral conscience of the individual banker, whether or not he takes his hands off people's money. And the institutions that have been established, the police, the central banks, the Securities and Exchange Commissions, have been established primarily to protect those who are not in the know of how management operates. And when those institutions fail, they usually fail institutionally because the political leadership, and in the case of the United States, it was George Bush and then Bill Clinton, who decided that we want to go into an era of light regulation. So it cut across parties. It was Republican and Democrat. There was almost a conspiracy across both political parties to let Wall Street basically go unchecked. And that is the result that we're having today. So corruption is a very big problem. It's a problem in Africa. You ask the question, why don't we have an African among the 70 most powerful leaders in the world? And I know Africans don't feel good about this, but the truth is that we do have a crisis of leadership in Africa. My country, Nigeria, has a population of 167 million people. Okay, but if you look at the Mo Ibrahim Index on leadership, we're very low down. If you look at the World Economic Forum Ease of Doing Business, we're very low. Look at Transparency International, we're very low. You look at UNDP, Human Development Indices, we're very low. All those institutions cannot be wrong. Now, those four sources tell you there is a problem with leadership. And so the world appraises you. And you've got to go beyond complaining about not being on the list to say, how do I move up? Rwanda moved up on the ease of doing business list. Some countries have moved up on the Transparency International list. Others have moved up on the UNDP list. So until you get leaders who are willing to say, this is how the world sees me, and I need to do the right thing to make sure that I move up that scale on that assessment, you're not going to have the leadership that you want in Africa.
Thank you. Shardiha,